Hello everybody, it's Josie here. I'm going to be doing a book review. So it's kind of a two-book review, but it's also a book review on non-fiction and then also a little bit about an author. So it's a bit of a hybrid video for me. So the two books I'm going to be talking about to start off with is this one over here. So this is by Chris Kraus and it's called After Kathy Acker. And then the second book I'm going to be talking about in kind of the two-book review portion is this book over here, Against Memoir by Michelle T. Now, both of these books are non-fiction. So this is a series of essays by Michelle, and it kind of charts her life, but also her thoughts on queerness, on feminism, on women's rights. Really, really interesting non-fiction. And then this is, Chris Kraus has basically written a biography on Kathy Acker, who is a author, who was an author, and a very interesting, controversial author in her time. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to talk a bit more about Kathy Acker and also her book that I also read, Great Expectations. And Kathy Acker's work is always semi-autobiographical, I would say, because she draws a lot from her personal experiences and her personal life and puts them in this really quite challenging, crazy kind of style that's all her own. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with Michelle T first. So if anybody's seen any of my previous videos or some of my previous videos, Michelle is one of my all-time favorite authors. She writes predominantly about the queer scene in San Francisco and California in the 1990s. So that is very much my era. That is very much what I love. I'm a child of the 90s, and reading about that whole scene is one of my favorite things, and I love anything set in the 90s. And Michelle writes a lot of nonfiction. But what this is it's this wonderful kind of, so it's called Against Memoir. So it's technically like a memoir of her life and different people she's met and different musings on her opinions and feelings. But it's not that kind of stereotypical narrative, you know, I was born here, then I did this, then I did that structure of a memoir. So this is, I think, really interesting, and this kind of series of essays and stories from her life and things that she has an opinion on. And like I said, you've got everything on, if you're interested in feminism, in queerness, in kind of dyke culture, can't even say that, dyke culture from the 1990s, anything like that, I think you'll find this incredibly interesting. And if you've read any of her books like Valencia, which I highly recommend, Dark Wave, again, her books fuse her own personal experiences and take those experiences and put them into her fiction writing. So it's interesting to kind of get her non-fiction writing as well, but you'll see a lot of the same narratives. You almost see some of the same characters, if I can call them, pop up. And I think that's where Michelle T is very similar to Kathy Acker in the sense that she uses a lot of her own personal experience and the people that she's met in a real life basis in her narrative work. So that brings me on to this book over here. So this is by Chris Kraus. Chris Kraus is famous for the book I Love Dick, which is a great title. And she has written this biography on Kathy Acker. Now, Kathy has or had a very interesting life as well. When she was alive, she would do interviews, and there are some really fascinating interviews that were taken during her life, and she had a way of kind of telling you about herself and about her life, but you never really knew what was true and what wasn't. So she would say things, and then she may do another interview and she kind of would contradict herself. So she was a really interesting character. She was incredibly controversial. So she was very much a kind of a feminist icon because she talked about sex the way not many women in sort of the 70s would talk about. She had this, her style is incredibly graphic. It's hard to read sometimes. I would say Kathy is not the author for everybody. It is, like I said, it's very graphic sex in her literature, and again she draws from her own life. So she draws There's a lot of reference to her mother's suicide in her narrative work, and kind of a relationship with her mother that was very fractured. Again, what is 100% true and what isn't is interesting, and Chris Kraus kind of delves into that in this book, and you also get excerpts from some of Kathy's work and then how that translates into her real life and the relationships that she had. Kathy was her main relationships were with men, but she was absolutely bisexual. There's a podcast actually with a series of letters that she wrote back and forth to I think it was a famous literary or art critic, female, and they kind of had a relationship and they wrote letters back and forth to each other. So Kathy is very much on, I would say, bisexual or sexually fluid, but very sexually promiscuous, very kind of dark sexuality that flows through her work. Also, the narrative of her work is challenging. And I'll talk about Great Expectations, but it's interesting, but it's challenging. But like I said, Kathy as a person is just fascinating to me. I really love her. I find her incredibly interesting and incredibly challenging to read her work, but also a really interesting person. So I've been watching a lot of kind of interviews that she was doing, a lot of listening to some podcasts and stuff on Kathy, and I think I think she's a very, very interesting kind of character to delve more into if you find that interesting. And just also on the queer bit, Michelle is queer. So that's to mention that. And then this book over here, so this is the real Kathy Acker, so you can see her picture there. Very striking. Clearly I fancy her. But so this book, Great Expectations, and it's kind of billed as a retelling of Great Expectations, the Dickens novel, but I wouldn't. Yeah, I think if you're looking for the Dickens novel in here, you'll probably be disappointed. She does use excerpts from it right in the beginning. Kathy also takes other people's work and uses passages from their work in her work, which was either applauded or criticised, depending on who you were. You know, the protagonist in here, they switch identities, they switch genders, it goes back and forth. There's no linear narrative to these books. There's some incredible writing, but it's not a linear story kind of way that Kathy writes. And again, some critics will love Kathy's work, some of them will hate Kathy's work. And similarly, some people will love this, will find this interesting and challenging and different, and the way the narrative is constructed and the way it just flops and skips and jumps and completely leaves you quite disorientated afterwards, which I quite like. But then some people absolutely hate that, so totally Marmite work. But I really enjoy this, and maybe enjoy isn't even the right word, but I find it incredibly interesting, and I find it incredibly interesting the way her mind works and the way she crafts her narratives. This is a very short book, so if you want to give it a go. Blood and Guts in High School is also very, very good. I've read that one. This one is shorter, so maybe if you want a shorter version, give this one a go, but Blood and Guts in High School is another one that I would recommend. So, on that note of kind of kick-ass women that are strong and have a feminist leaning and that are just interesting kind of, I listen to a podcast called Deviant Women, which I love and I highly recommend, and they go through women in history. So I was just listening to one on Anita Berber, who's incredibly fascinating. You have Tituba, which some of you might recognize from the Arthur Miller play. You have all these Medea, you have these wonderful, interesting kind of deviant women in history. And if we're kind of following that train of thought with both Michelle and Kathy, because they don't necessarily conform to convention of their time and their space and being girls, I'll recommend a couple of other books that are non-fiction that you might enjoy. So the next one that I'd highly recommend is this one over here, is Tracey Emin, Strangeland. And Tracey is a British artist. She's very famous for a piece of art that's basically called In Bed with Tracey. The bed, it's her bed. It's actually where she spent a lot of time when she was depressed. And it's a really interesting, thought-provoking piece that I really love. I love Tracey's work. It really makes me think, and I really find her incredibly interesting. But again, she is very much that kind of really challenging female artist. And again, a lot of people hate her, a lot of people love her, but she's not conventional by any means. And this autobiography is stunning. It's one of my favorites, and it's so interesting about her life. Also really hard to read, so trigger warnings. Same with like I said, with Kathy Acker, trigger warning for sort of rape and sexual assault in those books, and the same with this. But just fascinating person, fascinating character. Love her work, love her art. Then the next one that I would recommend, and not as challenging but still incredibly interesting, is Girls to the Front. So this is about the Riot Girl movement. This is by Sarah Marcus, and it talks about, so Riot Girl was the movement in the 1990s of kind of girl grunge rock music, female fronted music. It was women taking back, empowering themselves. So the famous line, "Girls to the Front," was what Kathleen Hanna kind of shouted at her gigs, because she wanted all the women to come to the front and mosh and be involved with the music and not be kind of held back by the men in the audience. And this is really, really fascinating. You see, I've tabbed it up quite a lot. I love Riot Girl music, and this really charts the history of Riot Girl in this incredibly interesting book. So if you're interested in that, definitely recommend that. And then the last one is Emma O'Toole, Girls Will Be Girls. So fascinating. This is, again, Emma is a kind of a comedian. So she has a very funny, interesting way of writing, but it's also non-fiction. It's kind of exploring gender roles. So Emma is queer, and it's exploring that idea of, you know, what it means to be a girl, and what do gender roles mean, and kind of shaking free and letting go of those. So an incredibly interesting book, one that I love, and actually I'm due to reread fairly soon because I haven't in a while. So that's it. That's me. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know if you've read any of those books, if you're interested in any of those people, and if you have any recommendations based on that. And I will speak to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.